I am going to briefly touch on these topics. Some challenges that I see are important context, a comment on retention and disturbance. Retaining water is something I want to touch on today, since now is my chance. I know there's more to come on that tomorrow. Back to a cultural point, I want to emphasize on transparency and some role models that we haven't spoken of yet today. First, so you know my background, I work full-time for Alberta Wilderness Association. It's a environmental NGO that was founded in the mid-1960s. Our focus is Alberta protecting the best and most important representative wilderness, and also improving land use and watershed management outside formally protected areas. Like Jorg, I want to talk about context, and this first, I have two slides on cumulative effects that I think are telling. In 2014, Global Forest Watch Canada published kind of an amazing report about industrial concessions, meaning leases, claims, licenses, tenures to either explore or exploit on public lands. And one of the findings was that 61% of Alberta's area, that's of Alberta's total area, has an industrial concession. BC is actually the highest province at 72%, but Alberta has the highest joint industrial concession density. 30% of Alberta has at least 2 industrial concessions. That's the highest of any Canadian jurisdiction, and it's roughly double the next highest, which was BC and New Brunswick, roughly tied. Alberta's boreal, 2/3 is covered by at least 1 concession, which is the highest boreal percentage of any jurisdiction in Canada. From another lens, if you look at the First Nation Treaty 8 Alberta side, 67% has at least 1 concession. 49% of that Treaty 8 Alberta area is forestry, 36% conventional petroleum and natural gas, 21% bitumen, 15% mineral claims. This map that I chose is another angle on that busy landscape. 70% of Alberta's concession areas are already accessed or fragmented. In other words, by their measure, human disturbance buffered by 500 meters is present in at least 70% of those concession areas, which is by far the highest amount for a province or territory with boreal forest. So forestry, in my view, our policies moving forward really needs to take into account the fact that we're not looking at a natural range of variation in many areas already because of other footprints, if not forestries. This is another way of showing that. I feel that ABMI's information on human footprint is really outstanding and useful. So this was a report about the oil sands region using the 2012 human footprint data, showing that 63% of an area the size of Florida is within 200 meters of human footprint. As Jorg said, the ALPAC 2016 report said that only 5.7%, only 6% of natural habitat is over 500 meters from human footprint. So I want to say, stepping back in terms of Alberta government policy, that the Land Use Framework and the Alberta Land Stewardship Act were really far-reaching, progressive pieces of policy and legislation. AWA supported both really since the ideas were first conceived. We still feel that there's really important work to be done in terms of accomplishing the vision. Some important things which we've supported further progress on are the biodiversity policy, biodiversity management framework, and very important accompaniment is the landscape management plan around surface disturbance. But these are all really important tools to live up to our international commitments to maintain biodiversity. And if Canada, as the prosperous society that it is, if we can't live up to that, who can? We're sure that we can have a future where not only we can thrive socially, economically, but many other species can too. So it's a very important policy context that we do that. Secondly, climate change. This is a mind-blowing map from Rick Schneider's of U of A's work in 2013, which I sort of call losing the boreal question mark. The map shows how the temperature and precipitation climate envelope is expected to change. This is just under a kind of median scenario. So the dry and the hot scenario, which take into account greenhouse gas emission projections, and then how temperature precip might respond, because there's various model suggestions about that. So the median one, which I show here, is not as troubling as other possible futures, but you know, it's really important to take that into account as well. And the third thing that I want to talk about is the culture, which we are pleased to see some movement in, but I think in the past it's been characterized by a very timber supply centric mentality. And the brief example I want to give on that is Hidden Creek in the Upper Oldman Basin. It was really an important area, by far the most important for migratory bull trout, and one of the less than 50 watershed stream areas left with genetically pure Alberta West Slope cutthroat trout. So amongst, you know, all the watersheds in the Old Man, there's strong reason to really make sure that the fish values of that were maintained. And yet, in 2012, it was swiftly logged for very minimal timber supply and royalties. It certainly provided a few weeks worth of jobs for some people, but you know, there are many other job drivers in southern Alberta as well. So we felt that there were strong grounds for compartment assessment. We were reassured in a way that it would be treated as a Class A water body, but then there were significant deviations allowed from that, with no offsets such as reclaiming, you know, another close to the stream OHV road. So we think of this as one example of a culture that we hope to see more shifts in the future, and we need to. A comment, I left this slide somewhat vague so that I could fill in based on a closer reading of the proposed policy. But one phrase that really stuck with me when I listened in on a webinar of a collaborative forest restoration area in Montana that I'll talk more about lately is one of the National Forest representatives said, with forestry in the future, it's going to be more about what you leave. In the past, it's been more about what you take. So I do want to congratulate the government of Alberta for this big, important step of proposing a directive that is prescriptive and clear about stand retention size expectations. I think that will really help in terms of biodiversity. So congratulations for that. We'll think more carefully about the details and get our comments in, but that's a really great step forward we want to encourage. We've heard today, and you know, digging into some of the other EMEN very helpful publications, that patch size matters, and so I think Colin's presentation had some really fascinating points about some of the best patch sizes in terms of biodiversity hotspots, rare plant communities. Hopefully, we could see companies being supported in some of those choices, so that the patches that are retained are of different sizes to accomplish different things, but also cover some of the most important areas. Another area of EMEND research that I didn't hear today, but I thought was really interesting, is on pollinators. It seems as though both quite high retention, 50 to 75% retention, minimized impacts in the short run, but after, in a longer run, stands with 10 to 20% retention seem to minimize impacts. And in that research, as well as we've heard with some of the land birds, there is actually a strong argument for quite large unharvested reserves incorporated in. So we hope to keep seeing progress in that direction too. Third-party certification helps, and to me, Forest Stewardship Council has been a kind of leading-edge idea generator. Right now, they're breaking new ground in terms of talking about intact forest landscapes. So I hope that we can see a lot of discussion, adoption, experimentation with companies and certifiers moving in that direction as well. Another experience that I just wanted to mention is what happens on the ground is really ultimately important, and that may seem like so obvious, but when we try to engage with some forest companies in terms of an entry point for stakeholders being the VOITs, the values, objectives, indicators, and targets, the values and objectives can be quite good and strong, but at the indicator target level, not so much. So it's what is adopted in those final stages, and then of course what happens on the ground in terms of deviation, in terms of documentation, if there's ways around that to avoid and minimize, that's really important. On the bigger picture of disturbance, I guess what I want to say is that we have a lot to learn. Fire and insects are, of course, important disturbance mechanisms. I can only speak for myself and my colleagues at AWA. Based on recent experience, as well as some longer lasting experience, we feel suspicious when we are told about things like fire smart or mountain pine beetle surge harvests that seem to be just another way to clear cut in valued landscapes. So we would really like to have more engagement where we understand the soundness of some of these. But really, it does seem, in terms of mountain pine beetle, that the surge approach and even building capacity and mandating more capacity in mills the cure may be worse than the disease in terms of biodiversity, certainly in terms of species at risk habitats. All right, retaining water. Brian Maitland, and certainly others before him, Aaron Bain and colleagues did a good study in northeast Alberta, but Brian's study was in the Upper Peace, the Simonette watershed, where in-stream habitat characteristics and fish communities were examined from 33 culverted, bridged, and reference streams in this industrialized region. It's heavily impacted by natural gas, liquids-rich petroleum extraction, but also there's significant forestry tenures. And like other studies, Brian's found significant impacts from culverts, fragmenting stream habitats. Also, even bridge crossings, there was certainly notable impacts from sediment, suggesting that even our efforts to put up silt screens and construct good crossings don't totally eliminate the impacts of roads and bridges and crossings. On the other hand, I think a really positive finding of this study is that optimizing models can achieve prioritizing objectives, and without very much money, a couple of $100,000 to $500,000, achieve in his study area really significant restoration impacts. So I hope in tomorrow's discussion there'll be a lot of application of that, because restoration dollars will never be enough, but if we can make them go as far as possible, it sounds, at least for water connectivity, we can achieve significant benefits. This is the Little Smoky Allapesh or Berlin Smoky Network. It's in the Upper Peace, Upper Athabasca, where we still have a blue ribbon native fishery, although it's threatened fish. There's Athabasca rainbow trout in some of these Upper Athabasca watersheds. There's bull trout, there's Arctic grayling. We have some very special rivers that rise in peatlands. rather than clear stone rivers, and provide cool flows year-round. There's already been identified fish restoration priorities. So wouldn't it be wonderful if we could find funds in this recession time? There's funds being talked about for construction, for what I would call hard engineering infrastructure. A lot of good could be accomplished and a lot of jobs generated in terms of restoration in these areas. And communities that rely on forests could really benefit from that approach as well. All right, now on to wetlands, and my focus is actually peat wetlands, not to say that the marsh wetlands aren't extremely important as well. According to SEMA, its 2014 Wetland Reestablishment on Oil Sand Mine document, Alberta's subhumid boreal plains are flat or gently rolling, and water movement patterns are largely a function of soil storage and groundwater flow versus other boreal Canadian regions where it's surface runoff. From Nick Kettridge's paper of 2015, which I'll talk more about in a minute, peat has a very high specific yield. In other words, you need a relatively high addition of water to induce a unit rise in water table. Now, what that means is it maintains near saturated water conditions and limits water table fluctuations. So I think there's been very important work lately on the importance of our activities in and around peat wetlands. Small-leaved sphagnum mosses dominate in high-latitude peatlands and can resist all but very intense wildfires. So this paper is of interest in terms of its integrated view of peatlands, potential role to reduce the effects of climate change on the whole forest. So it seems very likely that boreal mixedwood diversity will fall as this climate envelope changes in terms of temperature and precipitation, even if it's higher precipitation overall. These authors, actually I didn't list them all on this slide, but it's Schneider, DeVito, Kettridge, and Bain, so lots of local folks. If peatlands can be retained, they can help at least retain aspen forest and be a great resilience buffer against climate change. One strong mediation issue will be water table changes. So, of course, there's the larger issue about globally what we must do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But I was struck by, going back to Nick Kettridge's 2015 paper, that if water tables drop, and he looked at a peatland area where it was actually in industry lowering water tables before excavation, that you can get into a conversion where moss-dominated peatland can tip over into a non-carbon accumulating shrub grass ecosystem, which is much less fire and drought resistant. So I look at this, not being a peatland wetland scientist, but it tells me that with all the linear fragmentation we have out there, where and how forestry operates, as well as oil and gas around these peat wetlands, really matters in terms of the effect we have on its water table, and they can be, in a way, guardians, I think, of the forest. So I think that's a very strong direction we need to pursue. All right, back to the culture side. I think I could have used other words. Transparency is really important. Inclusiveness and accountability are important as well. The practice has evolved, is my understanding, at least in the Hidden Creek, that a reclamation plan is really a map, and very few people see it, and it's really hard to understand how the public can be involved and stakeholder groups in participating in developing it and the follow-up after. An organization like AWA doesn't have the capacity to be hands-on with everything, but we would like to be included much more in terms of understanding how peer-reviewed biodiversity indicators can be developed and achieved, how peer-reviewed fire return intervals are being applied in terms of managing, and how we can aim above a bare minimum and transcend some of the problems that we see coming with the fragmentation and the climate change impacts on the land. This map is actually was generated by the Ghost Watershed Alliance Society at one of the consultation sessions they went to in their area. This is in the northern part of the Bow watershed. They had to hand trace cut block maps that were provided to them. So in the 21st century, it should go without saying that stakeholder groups can have much more information online and available and can understand much better where are the points when they can influence before the layouts start to happen. And we need to return this information and this exchange to our public authorities, not just in the hands of forestry companies. In terms of role models, I think a really interesting one that I need to learn more about as well is the U.S. Forest Service Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. This began to be funded in the 2011 fiscal year, so 2010-11. There were 10 projects started that year, 10 in 2012, and another 3 in 2013. So 23 projects around the country. I know this map makes it impossible to see, but I learned about the southwest crown of the continent one, which is in Montana, through reading some documents in a webinar that my colleagues at CPAWS Southern Alberta really facilitated. And there was participation in that webinar by companies and public agencies. And so I don't know very much about the other partnerships, but I have read through the Forest Service 5-year report on that. And the intentions were to develop, it focused in the national forests, restoration at landscape level, reducing uncharacteristic wildfire risk, and returning more landscapes to fire-adapted landscapes to reduce fire risk and severity. So partly that was through thinning and harvesting, and that helped fund some of the other projects. Partly, though, it's engaging with communities because there's a really high collaborative element to make communities more open to some prescribed fire. So there's a lot of effort on the wildland-urban interface. One of the ground rules, though, was not establishing permanent roads. Others included strong collaboration and in partner investment and funding. So I represent an angle, but I'm starting with something that decision makers, of course, really care about, which is the socioeconomic impacts to communities. Local labor income being generated from this project. It was partly from selling the thinned lumber, but it was partly from lots of partner and matching agencies. And there was a really good multiplier in terms of the federal dollars invested. And this was just for the first 4 fiscal years. We ENGOs, I think, need to, and we are trying to, in our multi-sector experiences, do better at putting ourselves in the shoes of communities and industry. But we really value when scenarios can be shared transparently so that we can actually scrutinize socioeconomic assumptions. We have experienced in the past where some very, very inflated numbers, in our view, went very high up for decision makers. So socioeconomics is important, and it's important they be credible and that there be innovative ways to figure out how to make restoration and retention work. Here are some other important metrics with these 23 projects. The teal shows where they have not yet achieved what they thought they would by fiscal year 2015. The green shows where they've surpassed. So on some important watershed connectivity, on some important terrestrial and stream habitats, And then some charts I didn't show in terms of wildfire risk reduction, but also collaboration and relationships built. And I'm sure we can all think now of communities and community groups that are actually wanting in to more meaningful discussions. And so I really encourage the Alberta government to keep facilitating that, and for companies to be open to that. So I'll end on that. Thank you very much.